Welcome to High Truths on Drugs and Addiction, where national experts bring you facts and answers. I'm your host, Dr. Ronit Lev, an emergency and addiction doctor who has served at the White House and still practices on the front lines. Right here on High Truths, you will learn from experts from around the globe and around all aspects of drugs and addiction. To grow this community of information and action, I hope you give us a 5-star review. Come visit me on hightruths.com to learn more about the show or download a free prescription for naloxone. Carrying naloxone for drugs is like carrying an EpiPen for allergies. Today's episode is sponsored by Physicians for Healthy Communities, a physician-led organization that educates on the science of prevention to improve public health. Visit their website to learn how they prevent substance misuse while supporting individuals, families, and communities. Go to physiciansforhealthycommunities.org. Hello and welcome, everyone. This is the High Truths and Drugs and Addiction Season 4 finale with a live audience. High Truths has 4 full years and 210 total fascinating and informative episodes, with new episodes dropping every Monday. And I absolutely love hosting this podcast because I receive the most incredible education and continue to learn new insights from every one of my guests. And I get to share that education with you. High Truths is like a master's class on addiction, and each of you listening could easily earn a degree on this subject. And as a matter of fact, a special shout out goes to Bob Harkins, San Diego State University Department of Homeland Security's master students who were assigned this High Truths podcast to write a 1-page summary of one of their episodes of choice as an educational assignment. And thank you to our listeners. Because of you, High Truths has over 76,000 downloads as in ranked in the top 20 of addiction podcasts. But more importantly, the conversations we have led to action, drug policies, and solutions. And after over 200 episodes, you'd think we have exhausted the drug conversation. But no, there's more. There's always new perspectives, and we still have a horrid drug crisis. And this episode of High Truth season finale is dedicated to you. I know that you are passionate and opinionated on the issue of drugs and solutions. On High Truths, we learn together and we make a difference. And we have today in front of you an A-plus team of experts who will share their wise words. And I know you're anxious to hear from them because they are amazing. Each of our 3 speakers will give opening remarks with a focus on the drug crisis in 2024. We will then open it up to questions, and we will end with closing remarks from our panelists with hopes of 2025 from our esteemed panel. Our experts are all people I greatly respect professionally and go beyond their expertise as really humanitarians. Let me give them a brief introduction. Dr. Bertha Madras is professor of psychobiology at Harvard Medical School and formerly deputy director for the demand reduction at the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, ONDCP. She has numerous scientific publications, courses, patents, and awards. I follow Dr. Madras' service at ONDCP, and she's been an invaluable mentor. Dr. Libby Stuyt is an addiction psychiatrist from Colorado. Dr. Stuyt is my colleague and secretary at ISAC, the International Academy on the Science and Impact of Cannabis. She has expertise in treating the most complex cases of addiction and understands the brain mechanics to offer treatment and prevention. Dr. Weiner is an addiction psychologist. His perspective is informed by directing addiction service lines for hospitals and healthcare systems, research, and his own observation in private practice. Dr. Weiner has his own podcast called Let's Talk. So let's get started. And Dr. Bertha Madras, let's start with you and sharing with us some High Truth highlights of 2024.
So thank you, Ronit. It's always a pleasure to join you at the end of the year and to meet my esteemed colleagues, Libby and Aaron as well. I'm grateful because we have to develop some proposals for this coming year with a new administration. They face tremendous challenges. What is our current drug crisis? It is the most severe drug crisis we've ever had. we've had still, even though the overdose deaths are declining, we've still had more overdose deaths that are unacceptably high than in our past history. We have seen a concerted push towards normalizing and legalizing all drugs. It's eroded the foundations of drug policy. And the question is this erosion good or bad? And I hope to address it in a few moments. There are many stakeholders, including the pharmaceutical industry, including profiteers, politicians, hired social engineers. They've employed ingenious, yet disingenuous strategies akin to political campaigns to promote drug use. And underpinning these strategies is what I call generational forgetting. We've forgotten the lessons learned on the addictive and overdose potential of opioids, which we knew in 1823. The New England Journal of Medicine published 2 methods, 1823, 1828, on how to surmount an overdose. We knew about addiction during the 1800s. We knew about marijuana and psychosis from the India Hemp Commission in 1895. We knew about the problems associated with psychedelic use by the general population and misuse in clinical trials in the 1950s and 60s. And yet, we don't have people who are willing to dig into the past to try to understand the present and the future. Modern strategies don't only lean on generational forgetting. The strategies aim to reshape our perceptions, our laws, our social norms, our medical practices, and regulatory oversight. They often sideline scientific evidence of the consequences of drug use, the consequences not only to the individual, but to the families and to the local culture and to society as a whole. They steer the debate away from public health towards political processes. The heavy focus on exonerating or not arresting drug distributors is one example such as of many. What are the contradictory strategies? Some of them are piggybacking medical acceptance onto legalization movements, exaggerating the benefits and downplaying the risks, and shifting discourse towards social and personal justice. They exploit scientific literacy, not only in the public, but among politicians as well as in the medical profession. And they pressure endorsement of drugs such as opioids, marijuana, and psychedelics for all. The contradictions are to circumvent the FDA regulations through ballot initiatives and promise safer they promise safer products, which have failed to eliminate the illicit drug market and ensure public safety. There's also a challenge to counterintuitive solutions. The proposed strategies address the drug crisis by prioritizing harm reduction, but they lack scientific validity to some extent and overlook the complexities of the issues. Advocates argue for rescheduling of marijuana and federal legalization of marijuana and psychedelics and the provision of safe drug supplies. But they also advocate for minimizing abstinence as a treatment and just reducing the amount of drug use as a possible alternative to treatment. They advocate for supervised injection sites and non-coercive treatment tactics, which aim to meet individuals where they are, but they leave them where they are in a perpetual state of drug use that can hinder recovery efforts. We need a new paradigm in our country. We need a paradigm that focuses on prevention, that focuses on educating the public and the medical professionals and politicians and people in the legal profession on what the harms of drugs are to the individual and their broader circle of contacts up to many, many degrees of association. We need scientific literacy to help us come to conclusions that are best for public health. We need to educate parents on the consequences of drug use. And above all, we need to protect the most vulnerable people in our society, adolescents, the developing fetus, and people with co-occurring psychiatric problems. That's my introduction.
That is awesome. And it is very, very important and amazing how we do need to learn from history, and yet we don't. Dr. Libby Stuyt.
Wow, Bertha, thank you so much. That was an excellent overview, and I totally agree with everything you said. I really do believe that the focus has to be on education, and I am still amazed with how many people I speak with who don't know what I'm talking about. I do give lots of educational talks. I seem to be giving a lot to the DRE people in the country, because they are, struggling with this, because now marijuana use has increased. Daily marijuana use has surpassed daily alcohol use. Which
Jonathan Calkins.
Yeah. and we're seeing more and more crashes related to this, and people dying from people driving under the influence of marijuana. And I give a talk on all the mental health aspects that marijuana can affect people, and they all can affect someone's driving, that puts them at risk and society at risk. And so when I'm talking, it's a lot of the states that haven't legalized yet, and they're kind of like blown away with what we have in Colorado. And people need to be listening to that. And so the things that I'm most focused on right now are this increase that we see with violence associated with cannabis. And that is something that has been around for a while. I didn't realize that until I ran into an article by Raphael Mechoulam, that was written in 2002. So that's some time ago. But this article was about how he discovered the cannabis receptors and how THC calmed down rhesus monkeys, and then how they discovered the endocannabinoid system, and going on and on and on. But in that article, he talks about the research that shows that when animals are stressed and given high THC, they become violent and aggressive. And that is something that is back there in 2002. And he also demonstrated that they can make rats killers. Like, apparently rats don't normally kill mice, but when they give them high THC, they can turn them into to mouse killers. And so it's muricidal. That's something that really concerns me, because I am seeing more and more evidence of violence associated with cannabis use. And one of the problems that I'm dealing with in Colorado right now is the fact that we have a law that allows people on probation to use medical marijuana if it's been recommended by a doctor. And it's extremely easy to get a medical marijuana card in Colorado. And when they get it, they are using high potency THC products. And so people that are doing treatment for these clients, so they're in court ordered treatment, they come in high. And the treatment provider can't really do anything about it. If they're drunk, they can tell them, I can't work with you. You have to stop drinking. But because they have a card from a doctor that says they can do medical marijuana, they can't say anything. That's crazy. And so this is, to me, legislators that don't understand the issues. And so we need to do a lot more education. People need to understand there's really significant problems. And then the other one is related to the opiate crisis. For most of the time I've been talking about marijuana, which has been like the last 20 years, I have pointed out the connection between opiates and cannabis. And there is a lot of research showing that. And we're starting now to see that there is a much stronger correlation. Of course, it's not causation yet, but I think it's really getting to that point where you can see that one of the biggest risk factors for developing opiate use disorder is starting to use cannabis when the brain is still developing. And that really, I think, can indicate that this is like a gateway drug. So I will stop at that point because I could just keep going on. I will stop.
Thank you, Libby. You know what, when you say about like, oh, well, if a doctor prescribes marijuana to, somebody involved in justice, it's okay. And it's like, but it's not exact. It sounds legitimate. Oh, a doctor prescribed it. But do I ever prescribe, oxycodone and then you take whatever dose you want whenever you want? And it doesn't have to be that dramatic. It could be, whatever, antibiotic. Take as many milligrams, whatever you want, whenever you want, because that's kind of how it's prescribed. And right. And, very different than Marinol 5 milligrams versus 99% dabs that you smoke. It doesn't follow.
We have, I have emails. I have it in writing where a doctor who was a recommender of marijuana was contacted by a therapist saying, did you really want this person to be dabbing or whatever? So could you tell me what product you recommended? What's the dose? What's the route? What's the frequency? And the doctor writes back, up to the patient per constitution.
Right. Sounds like malpractice.
Yeah.
Or just call it what it is, recreational. Do whatever you want. Don't pretend it's medicine.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's very interesting. Dr. Aaron Weiner.
Really, really important point. So I'll try to take us in a slightly different direction. And thanks, Renee, for having me on for the finale here. I think when I look at where we are right now, here at the end of 2024, I see 3 intersecting themes right now that are also interacting with each other that I believe is putting us where we are. One of them has to do with this rise in addiction-related commercialism, right? Selling products for profit. The second has to do with our current media and social media ecosystem and how people get information or misinformation. And the third is the fact that there's a tremendous mental health burden right now in this country, and people are looking for solutions. So going back to the first one there again, in terms of the commercialism, something I speak about very often when I talk on this subject is that addiction is the only behavioral health problem that someone is literally trying to sell you. No one is selling depression. No one is selling anxiety, but people are selling addictive products, and the more people they can get hooked and the younger they can hook them, the more money they're going to make over time. So the profit incentive there is extremely strong. And we see this dynamic play out in different ways over time, whether or not we're talking about Purdue Pharma, whether or not we're talking about the THC, big cannabis right now, whether or not we're talking about psychedelics, we're seeing it where you've got all this money pouring into a space. And there's a big emphasis then on how the public perceives it and how many people are using it. And there was a word that I came in contact with over the past year or two that really resonated with me about where we are as a space generally right now, which is greenwashing, where you take a concept and you make it seem healthy. And people are very into health right now, right? They're trying even speculative health, right? When we think about things like that are less evidence supported, like adaptogens and nootropics, and it's not to say that there isn't some evidence there, right? But people really want to feel like they're taking care of themselves. And so when we're starting to see these markets spring up, there's always this guise or this veneer of, well, isn't it medicine anyway? Isn't it therapeutic? Isn't it useful? But although there's this push towards people wanting to be healthy, there's not a lot of very clear emphasis on evidence, on data. There's a lot of hopefulness. There's a lot of trusting media figures who you think that you can trust. But when you actually dig into what's being published in medical journals, what's being published in psychological journals, there's a huge gulf there between what's actually being published and what people think they know. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the amount of money you put behind a message right now very much is related to the uptake. How much you're being seen on social media, how much you get in front of people. And that's always been part of this push-pull between addiction for profit and public health, is that there's a lot of money on that side, right? Which then feeds back into a marketing engine. And the folks of us who work on the public health side, who are part of institutions, or even folks like myself who just care, but I'm just a private citizen, our megaphone is much smaller, which means ultimately that it takes more of us to make the difference, which is why podcasts like this one are so important, because we get to spread this information around. The last component, though, I was mentioning, we've got the commercialism, we've got the information ecosystem, but then we also have this incredible mental health demand where right now people are really struggling when you look at rates of anxiety and depression, and they want solutions. In many cases, they're desperate for them. And so when someone tells them, hey, you can turn to this intoxicant, you can turn to this substance that's going to solve your problem, maybe in a natural way or in a better way, or one dose and you're going to be better, or they hear this, they think it's a panacea. There's such a strong wish for it to be true that people are falling in right now more than ever before, instead of going more towards some of the evidence-supported interventions that we do have. Right. And I know I'm a little bit biased here as a psychologist because I know what some of these things are. But even when we're talking about pharmaceuticals, right, there's a study that came out this last year that found that only 5% of individuals who are hospitalized with an alcohol-related condition leave with a prescription for one of our 3 FDA-approved medicines for alcoholism. 5%, 1 in 20. That's outrageously low when you compare that to any other condition, but for addiction, for alcoholism, this is where we are. So I guess to lead back to what I know Libby was saying, what Bertha was saying, education is so important right now. It's so important that we have conversations like this one so that folks can get in touch with the information that they need to actually make informed decisions as practitioners, as preventionists, as parents, or just as people who are coming into contact with these substances in their daily life. So thanks again for having me on the conversation. I look forward to our time together today.
That's great. Thank you so much. Very enlightening, Aaron. And now we will open it up to questions. I don't see anything in. Please go ahead and put your questions in the chat. And as I'm waiting for your official questions, I'm going to just kind of ask some of my own. And I'll start with Libby. Libby, you are in charge of demand reduction at ONDCP. What's the balance of supply and demand? People always, toot the prescriptive that they have. If you're a clinician, you're working on demand side. If you're in law enforcement, you're working on supply side. What's the right balance?
First of all, we need a balance between supply and demand reduction. Leaning only on one or the other is a waste of time. It's, for example, it's the same as saying housing first for people with psychiatric and substance use disorders. If you put them into housing without any treatment, it just doesn't make sense to them. And if you leave that housing open to drug dealers, it makes worse sense because a lot of people are dying in housing first from overdoses. So you need a balance between the two. The demand reduction side, from my perspective, has to be drawn out far greater than the way it's being carved and molded at the present time. At the present time, what we're seeing is a focus on harm reduction and treatment and rescue. And from my perspective, that's critically important because obviously death is the ultimate disaster for an individual life. But if we don't stop the pipeline to addiction, if we don't stop the pipeline to use, we're never going to get a handle on it. And the costs are just going to continue to escalate and escalate. And right now, some of the costs are estimated to be in hundreds of billions of dollars for the opioid crisis, for alcohol, for nicotine, and for marijuana, and for other drugs. So we have to have a much broader approach to demand reduction than we currently have. And that means prevention. That means educating every single parent in this country that A, you don't use substances while you're pregnant. B, you protect your children from the day they're born and educate them on the harmful consequences of drugs. And even if that may only affect 10%, in some cases, some of the consequences are only 5%. In other cases, they can be 30%. It does not matter. If you protect the developing brain during adolescence, you can establish a healthy brain for a lifetime. And I just feel that we're so focused now on the opioid crisis that we have lost sight of the much broader strategies that need to be implemented in our country. And definitely supply reduction is a critical component of it as well. Because when people openly sell fentanyl on the streets of San Francisco and the police do nothing about it, we are dooming people who are homeless, who have many social determinants of why they're there, but we are dooming many of them to an inevitable death, may it be this year, 5 years, or 20 years from now. Half of the people with heroin addiction are dead in 20 years to 30 years. Those are early studies, but I'm sure they are valid today as they were then, and even more so with fentanyl and carfentanil.
Yeah, I don't think you can last 20 years with fentanyl now like you would in heroin. I think your lifespan is cut even shorter. Bertha, that's very true. Comment from Joe Dokes from the Q&A. He says, not a question, but an observation is, I think he's expressing that the new administration will deport not just illegal immigrants, but illegal growers, and sees hope in that solution. If you look at the data, we were saying, and you mentioned this in your intro, Bertha, that the deaths from fentanyl are going down. But if we also see that, and I don't know if this is true yet, but if the deaths are going down, but the number of 911 calls, naloxone, non-fatal overdoses are staying the same, that to me means potency reduction and a supply reason. Because everybody once says, oh yes, the deaths are down because of naloxone, the deaths are down because of Suboxone. I don't think we're going to naloxone or Suboxone our way out. It's like you said, upstream primary prevention and upstream supply.
And if I may add something, one of the things that I don't think is on the radar screen of people who use opioids, it's one thing to rescue people after an overdose, but multiple overdoses will lead to brain damage. And there is increasing evidence on that. So that just the fact that you have been rescued and are alive is a massively important achievement. But the fact that your brain is susceptible to anoxia and to loss of glucose, oxygen, and so on, that can lead to the death of nerve cells means that you may promote irreversible damage to your brain. So it's, from my perspective, the rescue is critical, but there is a downside to multiple overdose.
Yeah, well, even one overdose can cause brain death. It depends on the time element of how long your brain hasn't had oxygen, right? We see that in the emergency department. So it's a total cumulative time. And sometimes it's too late. Libby, question for you, and continue to our audience. Please continue, put your questions in the Q&A and we'll get to them. But Libby, question to you is the impacts of psychedelics. There's a lot of promotion of using MDMA to treat PTSD, marijuana for PTSD. My rabbi's wife told me in the Hasidic community they're using it to psychedelics to get closer to God. I don't know how evidence-based that is. What are the impacts of psych? Is it so bad to use? You just have a bad trip and that's it, or what is it?
Well, first of all, cannabis and PTSD, there is no study showing that it's beneficial. In fact, almost all for PTSD in the long run. Yes, it works. It works initially. It numbs you. It takes away intrusion, flashbacks, that kind of thing. But then you have to use it all the time, and you end up having problems. Psychedelics, on the other hand, there is some evidence that they can be beneficial, and it's just the studies are showing this is done in a very controlled environment where there are like 2 therapists available with the patient for like up to 8 hours. And that's with either psilocybin or with MDMA or ketamine. I mean, I've talked to physicians who are doing this and like doing ketamine group therapy, which is really kind of fascinating. but they're very controlled, and the people are being followed very closely. I, in my practice, have treated many people that have had very bad outcomes from hallucinogens, and including death. I mean, these are not safe drugs. And like in Colorado with psilocybin, we have it's legal. The people can grow their own, they can gift it to other people. They can't sell it because that's illegal, but they can gift it. And so people can use it without this controlled environment with the therapist there who's trained to help you work through all this. And then it also just got passed that they can be put into chocolates. Like, I mean, to me, if it really is going to be used as medicine and it works as medicine, it should be in a capsule that is non-definable. I mean, a bland capsule. And then the adult person can chase it with a chocolate bar if they have to have chocolate. But I think that putting it into chocolate is a nightmare to happen, because yes, we have kids getting into gummies with cannabis, and it's very scary for the parents. Yes, the kids don't die, but some of them are, comatose for quite some time. And we don't know what that actually is doing long term to their brain. But with psychedelics, you can actually die from that. And so these are things that I think people need to pay attention to, and especially with this idea of descheduling or rescheduling. I see that Archie Blyer has asked if Schedule 2 would be acceptable, or does it have to be Schedule 1? And I think these people that are going to be figuring this out have to think about the fact that the high potency THC products, like wax shatter, vape oils, that are really high concentration THC, they are no different than the other scheduled drugs, Schedule 1 drugs, in terms of their danger, and they don't have medical benefit. There is no research showing that they're beneficial. And so I don't know how they decide, if they're going to say cannabis is Schedule 3. Does that include all the high potency products, or is there a limit? Is there a THC level that it's acceptable at? I don't know. Those are very hard questions.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you, Libby. Again, I learned that from you, that those high potency dabs and shatters, it's like legalizing methamphetamines, and it's like using methamphetamines, and that's what we're seeing in the emergency department. We don't see people who are mellow. We see people hyped up, high blood pressure, high heart rate, severe agitation, like methamphetamine with those products. Erin, mental health as a psychologist and substance use disorder, there's a lot of overlap there, and yet even on a federal level, we put those in different buckets and don't address really the whole person that has both problems. What are we doing wrong? What should we be doing better?
Yeah. Well, so a word that Bertha used that I like to use a lot as well is pipeline, both in terms of when we think about people making their way towards ultimately a catastrophic outcome like death, but also in terms of even developing a substance use disorder in the first place. And as a psychologist and as an educator, I always like to say that all behavior has a purpose. There's a reason why everyone chooses to do what they do, particularly when what they're doing has some pretty clear negative side effects, when it's not a clean burning fuel per se. And so when you look at what's going on with substances in America, and you look at what's on the way up, there's that commercial side to it. But as I was mentioning before as well, there's also this desire for people to try to solve their discomfort, to solve depression, to solve anxiety, to solve trauma. Again, it's since COVID hit, there's been such a huge amount of mental health burden in this country where people are feeling overwhelmed and they don't necessarily feel like they have the tools to deal with it. And so for me, when I think about the intersection here, it's not necessarily, it's a chicken and the egg scenario, and ultimately it doesn't really matter which one comes first. Addiction can lead to mental health concerns. Mental health concerns can lead to addiction. However, I do think that it would be very much behoove us as a society to be more aggressively teaching mental health literacy and coping skills to young people. Because almost invariably, when people develop addiction problems, they're getting started on this in their youth, in their teenage years. And that's oftentimes in response to either some sort of social pressure, either explicit or implicit, or because they're trying to figure out how to deal with their stress or their depression, or what's going on maybe in their home if they're in some sort of adverse circumstances, and they don't feel like they have the ability to manage that. And we don't like, as organisms, we do not like to be uncomfortable. When we feel uncomfortable, we want to soothe it as quickly as possible. Like if I get heartburn, Tums are going in. You know what I mean? I'm like reaching for the Tums, probably maybe more than I should. But when it comes to something like depression, when it comes to something like anxiety and how many tendrils that can have across your life, or when it comes to feeling like you're socially isolated, which again, just COVID put that into an afterburner state, right? In terms of people feeling alone. It would be really tough if you were, say, at school and everyone around you was vaping and you want to be part of that group. It's very hard then to be the only person not using nicotine, for example. So I think we have to be thinking a lot about mental health. I think we need to be supporting young people with solutions to their mental health concerns, to identify them and address them before they have to turn to these, they don't feel like scorched earth options, chronic intoxication at the time, but ultimately that's what it is. There's more elegant ways of solving these problems for kids and for adults, of course. But they need to know what they are and they need to practice them.
Yeah, I share, when my 2-year-old granddaughter had a birthday party, I went to her classroom and they had a big sign that says calming measures. And this is for 2-year-olds. It's like, take a breath, tell an adult, drink some water. These are calming, and I'm thinking we need that, up till high school, and some adults can use some of these strategies. But yeah, I think that's I think we all
Can we put that on the wall in emergency departments? Like, take a breath,
take a breath,
drink some water. Just
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very important. So again, for our audience, I encourage you to raise your hand, type in your questions. We really want to hear from you. And Archie Blyer, you mentioned about scheduling. And Bertha, you have been one of the few people who have been selected to testify in this schedule hearing that the DEA is coming about. It's starting under Biden administration. It's going to kind of go over to the Trump administration. What can you tell us about that hearing and what's going on with that?
Well, the drug rescheduling shows us how ambivalent, how our attitude towards marijuana has been throughout our history. It's been ambivalent, it's been prohibitive, it's been acceptance, all three, and it's flowed back and forth. So the Biden administration instructed Department of Health and Human Services to examine the potential for rescheduling. They came up with a 146-page report on why marijuana should be rescheduled. They actually redefined the 8-part analysis and the 5-part questionnaire that the DEA imposes in order to put marijuana into a lower drug schedule without FDA approval. And so there's a great deal from my perspective on why they did this, and from it because I'm on the Council of Academic Freedom at Harvard, I feel very empowered to be politically incorrect and say that the rescheduling was a political decision, not a scientific one, for the following reasons. One is that the rationale, and I'll just go through 2 of the multiple points. We've all mentioned, what doses and formulations and so on. We're all aware of that. But one of the rationales is that it's widely used in practice. And when you actually calculate of this over 770,000 physicians who actually see patients in the country, it's about 2% that have prescribed, not prescribe, recommend marijuana. You can't prescribe it because it's not FDA approved. So that the rationale for that this is widely approved and widely accepted in the medical community is, from my perspective, erroneous. And we also have to remember that it wasn't the medical community that ever pushed for the use of marijuana as a medicine. In fact, most of the medical organizations push back. The second critical point is the evidence, as Libby touched on, the evidence for its effectiveness and safety with regard to medical conditions. And the HHS report places tremendous emphasis on pain. And now the pain studies are very limited. They are flawed, and they're flawed because, number one, there's the doses that were used in those pain studies were as high as 6% THC, whereas in dispensaries now THC is 20% and could be as much as 90%. So to claim that the adverse effects that were determined in these few clinical trials that use smoke marijuana for pain are not really relevant with current marijuana. The second problem with the pain story is that the International Association for Pain has said there simply isn't good enough evidence. And if you look at the Epistemonico site from Santiago, Chile, which literally just cruises through the internet constantly to look at all the publications in the medical community, they have looked at all the meta-analysis for pain, and they've come up with the same conclusion, that there simply is not good enough evidence for safety and efficacy. The studies that are referred to in the National Academy of Medicine that was used, that HHS heavily leaned on, were completed by 2017 and reported in the National Academy of Medicine report on marijuana. And that was a flawed conclusion, because most of the studies that were done with marijuana and pain were done only with neuropathic pain. And they were of very short duration, just a few weeks. What happens after a year's use? The latest data on the development of a cannabis use disorder among people using cannabis for pain is somewhere between 25 and 30% have a cannabis use disorder. So that's an adverse event that never got into any of this. And you would never get into it if you're going to just do a 2-week study. So there's so many flaws in it that I think that, from my perspective, rescheduling it at this stage of our knowledge is possibly premature and possibly wrong for the duration. Do we schedule it to Schedule 2 as opposed to 3? It's the same problem. Once you put a drug into schedule below Schedule 1, you are claiming that it is a legitimate medicine and that physicians can prescribe it, even though it's not FDA approved. So if the motivation is to do research on it, CMCR in California that did all these neuropathic pain studies never complained about the Schedule 1 as inhibiting or preventing them from doing them. GW Pharmaceuticals that examined the effect of cannabidiol, and their trademark is Epidiolex for rare forms of seizure disorders in children. Cannabidiol was a Schedule 1. They never complained that because it's Schedule 1, they couldn't do the clinical trials. So if that is a motive, to be able to do research, it's also, from my perspective, a false narrative. What to do about people who claim it alleviates pain? We can't ignore the individuals who do claim it. And from my perspective, we should have a registry and do what we did years ago. And that is the small number of people for whom nothing else works, no other safer drug works, then perhaps there could be a Schedule 1A which maintains very stringent controls on the whole field. But other than that, I don't see the rationale holding out against stringent scientific evidence.
Interesting. As you mentioned pain and marijuana, because that's what it's really being promoted on, it made me think, I don't know if any of you guys are in the audience thought of this, but Luigi Mangione, the young boy who killed the CEO of a health plan in New York, and there's a lot of press on that. And I'm thinking, here's a young man who had chronic pain from a back injury, and maybe he added marijuana to that, became addicted to marijuana, and caused his psychosis, because he seems like he has some type of psychosis, right? We kind of saw that on TV. I don't know if we'll ever learn. I mean, he could have just developed psychosis by, from genetics and age, but it could be. I mean, it follows the typical story of chronic pain, adding marijuana, that age group, and having cannabis-induced psychosis. What do you guys think?
Well, there actually was a report that he had engaged in psychedelic treatment for that. And so I don't know, we don't know anything about that. We don't know if he continued, how that happened. That is also another problem with the psychedelic studies, is that, if you have a physician on site, a prescriber on site, and they can give it to you right then, as opposed to giving you a supply that you keep in your house and you use whenever you want to. There's a big difference between those two things. And that I just, in my experience, have treated quite a few people with abuse of ketamine, abuse of MDMA. I mean, back in the 2000s, ecstasy was a huge drug in my treatment program, where so many people were using it. And so these are abusable things. And yeah, I would love to know what the toxicology on that gentleman was, but those are not things that we are privy to. I mean, we do try and get toxicology on all unintended violent deaths, and it's very, very hard.
Yeah. I think if the public and law enforcement would understand that connection, there'd be more awareness and more willingness to share those kind of results, because it's also a prevention method, right? I mean, he could serve as an example of prevention. Speaking of examples of prevention, Elton John publicly stating that marijuana legalization has been the greatest mistake in the United States and Canada. And I think he even mentioned that, when he was using, he was a a-hole, and that people act that way without knowing it. And what are your thoughts on that? He should be like a, marijuana prevention spokesperson.
Well, I think one of the most important features of drugs, with particularly marijuana, is what I call anosognosia. And you're a psychiatrist, or the physicians here would know what that means. But it's essentially being unself-aware of the of a problem that one has in terms of behavior or thought disorder. I think marijuana is probably the kingpin of all the drugs with regard to being unself-aware, because so many people are diagnosed DSM-5, according to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, with a cannabis use disorder. And the estimates are, as I said, it's 25 to 30%. And yet the number of people who appear for treatment is far, far less. It's far disproportionate to what it should be, based on the objective criteria that are embedded in DSM-5. And I think that's really an important concept for families and for users to learn, that there is so much self-delusion with regard to drugs in terms of them making you feel a lot better, when in fact there are a lot of things that are happening in your life that are really going downhill. But with an special focus on marijuana, David Smith, who had this clinic in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, he once shared with me, after he had seen thousands and thousands of patients from the 1960s on, and he felt that the worst drug in terms of self-delusion was marijuana.
Yeah, I think that's important. Okay, so the word of the day of this webinar is anosognosia. That's hard to say. Anosognosia, lack of awareness of perception of impairment. That's important with substance use disorder, mental health, and like Libby, you mentioned before, drug driving. Let's see. We have a question here from Thomas Vegas, who runs the SAM Massachusetts page on Twitter. He says, thank you. And his question relates to the common comparison rationalization people make between alcohol and marijuana, regulatory policy perspectives and harm perspectives. Can you guys, anyone who wants to tackle but it's better than alcohol rationale?
I guess I can just chime in quickly and say, I usually go that it's different than alcohol. Obviously, alcohol is an incredibly caustic substance to the body, and if used long term, can just burn through lots of different organ systems in the bones. I don't think anybody's debating that. I do think, however, though, when we're talking about youth, which particularly when we're then pivoting over to THC is where most people are using it, is when they're in their younger years. That's when you see the greatest risk profile, particularly to the developing brain and just the overall life trajectory in terms of how it can derail that. There's also certain psychological and neuropsychological, neurological changes that THC does that alcohol doesn't. And so I think when you're trying to put the two of those next to each other and say, well, one is better or one is worse than the other, they're actually both oftentimes very negative. It's just depending on how. And I think instead of debating valence, we should maybe shift the conversation over to like what might actually be healthy. Like whatever problem you're trying to solve or means you're trying to achieve, maybe there's a way to do it that doesn't involve introducing a substance into the body that causes chronic problems. That's oftentimes where I try to take it.
And I agree. And I think that the important thing is to recognize that the combination is really dangerous. And the Department of Transportation in Colorado just came out with a really nice educational piece that is basically addressing, the holidays. But I liked it because there are many, many people that think that I've just had one drink, I can drive. And yes, they're not at the level of intoxication with their one drink. But then they think they can take a gummy and then augment their alcohol. And that can actually make them really impaired. And I think that they don't realize that.
Those are good answers. I usually go to the science of it. It's like, well, they're different. One is water soluble, one is fat soluble. Marijuana is fat soluble, and one of the fattest part of your bodies is your brain. I think you taught me that, Libby, and it just sticks around there. So in that sense.
Yeah. And there are some very interesting studies on high school students showing that kids who binge on weekends as opposed to kids who use marijuana, and these are non-disordered states of use, the kids on marijuana do worse in terms of school achievement, in terms of graduation, and so on and so forth. It's always the chicken and egg, the causation versus correlation. But it does appear that it has more adverse effects in terms of the future outlook of young people than alcohol binging, not alcohol use disorder. In terms of alcohol use disorder, marijuana is catching up very quickly. Amongst the 18 to 25-year-olds, approximately 16% of people who use have an alcohol use disorder. 16.4, I believe, and among marijuana users, it's 16.6. And the overall, on a population basis, the overall addiction of marijuana appears to be higher than alcohol. So if you just put addiction into one bucket, that's alcohol is certainly not less benign than marijuana. Or and then when we get into psychosis, emergency department people come into emergency departments with psychosis because of drug-induced, marijuana-induced psychosis, as opposed to alcohol-induced psychosis. The people who convert to schizophrenia subsequently, the conversion rate is much higher amongst people who use marijuana than it is for alcohol. And the same is true from the India Hemp Report. They showed that people who are heavy users of alcohol and opioids were far less likely to be in the so-called insane asylums in Bengal than people who use marijuana. So there are comparisons that make alcohol look more benign than marijuana. There are comparisons that make alcohol look far deadlier than marijuana. I just think the consequences diverge, and from for that reason, they should not be compared. They should be looked at one-on-one with regard to their adverse effects.
Yeah. So last kind of question for each of you. If you had to give advice to the Trump administration coming in to tackle all the things that we're talking about, what would be the advice? Maybe we could start with you, Aaron.
Yeah, well, I think if I had to give an elevator pitch, it would be going upstream, right? There's that parable of two folks walking by the river, and they see a child in there, and they jump in and save them, and then there's another two, and they jump in and save them, and then there's this flood of kids, and one of the guys, gets out of the river and starts walking, and the other one says, "Where are you going? There's these drowning kids," and he says, "I got to go upstream and figure out why they're falling in the first place, because we can't save them all." And I think ultimately that's where we are, where it's not that we should stop saving everybody we can, but we have to think about why people are falling in, and then also recognize that it's going to take some time for those sorts of preventative efforts to come to fruition. That's the hardest part about prevention, is we have to be patient. It's like planting a seed and waiting for a while to actually see if it grows. Like you look at the CDC provisional overdose rates, for example. An overdose rate, that is a delayed metric, right? So like what we're seeing now, the reason why things are finally going down, despite the fact that we've been paying attention to opioids and trying to intervene and do things for years, is because it is a pipeline. I'll come back to that phrase again. And if we cut things off at the beginning, yeah, there's fewer people going into the pipeline, but there's, what about that secondary prevention? There's folks that are still on their way potentially to that very negative outcome. And I think we're finally seeing the results of all of the labors that went into stopping people from going down that pipeline to begin with finally coming due. And why I think the national year-over-year rate right now is down 17%, which is fantastic. And hopefully we'll see that continue. But we have to think that way about mental health. We have to think that way about addiction and maladaptive coping, I think, more generally, and put our money where our mouth is. And that does mean investing in things that you might not see the outcome of within the election cycle. That's the hardest part, right? It might take more than 2 or 4 years for this to pay off, but it doesn't mean it's not worth investing in. And I think we have to be bold enough to make those sorts of moves.
Great. Bertha?
Thank you, Ronnie. I think the most important issue that we should do with the new administration is to develop a completely different paradigm of how we look on drugs. We're seeing the movement towards destigmatizing drug use, not just people with substance use disorders. We're looking towards acceptance of drug use and substance use disorders as a norm. What we have to do is educate the public in the best possible, using the best possible science available on the harmful effects, not only to the individual, but what it does to families. And I've seen families who've had kids become psychotic because of marijuana or develop schizophrenia, which they feel certain the drug was the etiological agent. And they say what it has done to our families destroy hope for all of us. We have to develop a new paradigm with regard to drug use and not use it as a crutch for mental health problems, for stress problems, for anxiety problems. We have to develop a way to promote prevention throughout our society, and especially amongst the vulnerable people, and also focus as well on supply reduction. It is critical.
Thank you, Bertha. There's a question for you, Bertha, also before we get to Libby's elevator pitch to President Trump. There's a question about the ability to do testing for driving under the influence of marijuana. Is there any new updates on that?
There are a few people doing some very innovative work. Eden Evans at the Mass General has been trying to develop a portable brain scan that can seems to be specific and for marijuana intoxication. It's associated with an ability to perform well on cognitive testing. There are a few other people who are working on avenues like this because blood tests are clearly irrelevant. We have found in my lab that the brain levels of THC are much higher than blood levels 24 hours after the last dose. And because THC is so fat soluble, it's just going to accumulate in the brain. So using blood as a model for intoxication, unless you do per se, yes or no, you have marijuana on board or not, I don't think it's going to work. I think we need much more innovative strategies, and I think there are a few that are being developed.
The preventive messages, if you're working in prevention, they've done simulation tests of people who smoke, not the high potency, but regular marijuana, and 4.5 hours, you may have impaired peripheral vision, stopping ability. So if you wait 4.5 hours after smoking, at least 8 hours after edibles before you get behind the wheel, or even enter, somebody else who's a driver. Teaching teenagers don't get behind the wheel of somebody else driving if they've been smoking, just like we do it with alcohol. So 4.5 hours for smoking, 8 hours or more for more, and then, the other things. And Libby, your elevator pitch.
Okay, I would love to speak with the administration. I would love to give a talk for the administration. I would love for them to be open to hearing from those of us who work in the field about the harms. Because, as I said, when I do talk to people, they're like blown away. They don't know that this is causing this. And I think some of the most important information out there is coming out of looking at legalized states. So recreational legalization, medical legalization versus the states that have not legalized. And the evidence is becoming overwhelming that there's increased suicide acts in children, adolescents in states that have legalized versus the medical states versus the recreational, the non-legal states. And then also the opiate overdose, the overdose deaths, they're very correlated with the legalization of cannabis. And there's even more research coming out about cancer and different things in young people, because they're the number one people using these things. And so I think that education is going to be paramount. And I have experienced that in Colorado, where we give little talks to the legislators, where we will meet with them individually, and we have a little PowerPoint. We have a family member talking to them. And we have educated a lot of legislators that way.
That's great. All right. I like that. Elevator speech is like, let me speak more. So we have a very wise audience. Thank you all for participating today, joining us, engaging in this important dialogue. And now I give it back to our experts to conclude with their high hopes for 2025 and beyond. And so let's start with Aaron, with you. What are your closing remarks?
All right. Well, so when I think of high hopes and where I hope people can go, so that Elton John comment, I just heard about that today. And something that stuck out to me about that was that how important it is that we all use our voice in whatever platform that we have. something that I've thought quite a bit about recently is that there are so many more celebrities I've found, if you just take a step back and think about it, that really associate like their name or their image and likeness to what we'll call them vice industries, whether or not it's online sports betting, whether or not it's having their own brand of alcohol, whether or not it's having their own THC product brands. But we don't hear nearly as many of these very public figures coming out talking about healthy coping. We don't hear them talking like championing, like starting their own therapy company, or something else, or their own meditation app, right? Or something that actually promotes health and wellness. It's usually the other side. And that's why it's so notable in some ways when someone like Elton John speaks out. Usually when you have someone say high profile, it's something like what happened to Matthew Perry, where, he's tragically dying due to, we'll call it complications from ketamine in a hot tub. But it was, which is a whole nother rabbit hole we could go down. But that's it's usually those sorts of moments where it's very negative, like cautionary, if you will, but not necessarily promotional. And so I'm a huge believer in that Stephen Covey example of your circle of influence versus concern, where we all have a lot of things we're concerned about. But if we put our energy there, we end up spending it in a way that's not effectual. And your influence shrinks. But your circle of influence lies inside that larger circle of concern. And if you work with what you have, you push into that circle of influence, it tends to grow and get larger. And so for those of us, Renee, thanks again for inviting us on this podcast. It's our ability to influence through this amazing platform and spread ideas that hopefully resonate and can ripple out and influence others. But we all have that ability within our own communities or schools or families. And I think because we don't have the platform of Elton John, because we can't necessarily walk into HHS or walk into the president's office and make a pitch, where we have to start is where our influence lies. And I just really wish everybody, as much as possible, to flex that, because we do have influence and we can make a difference. And it starts locally. It starts at home. It starts in our communities, families, what you can actually touch. So if there's something that you're passionate about, if you heard something today, or if you care about prevention or drug policy, call the people you can call. Talk to the people you can talk to. Talk to your kids if you're a parent. That's where this all starts. So that would be my wish for 2025.
That's beautiful. Beautiful. Libby?
Okay. I know that prevention works, and I know that treatment works. And I agree with Bertha that we need to change our paradigm, and we need to stop thinking about, and I agree, the harm reduction thing, it has a place, but it's being pushed way, way, way too much. And part of that is because treatment's expensive. It is expensive, but I know from my own experience running a 90-day treatment program, inpatient, with really great outcomes. That was abstinence-based, but we had a lot of time, and we could really work with people and work in the trauma and give them educational tools and coping skills and those kind of things. And my goal I would love to see us be able to go back to that we actually had real treatment that we could provide to people.
Awesome. Beautiful. And Bertha?
Well, I always close with my same refrain. The reason that we've had social and legal disincentives to use drugs is because there is within our human instinct to protect the brain, which is the source of all our wisdom, all our civilizations, all our laws, our poetry, our science, our math, everything. It's from the brain, and from the brain only come all these remarkable skills that is the repository of our humanity. And I think that we have to recognize that drugs can interfere, influence, affect, and damage this most precious component of human life. And therefore, we should do everything possible to promote prevention. And my Harvard X program is going to be finished in 2025. It's a program freely available to all parents on how to protect your children from drug use.
Wow, that's great. Can't wait to see it. Thank you all so much. Dr. Bertha Madras, Dr. Libby Stuyt, Dr. Erin Weiner. I know you're each extremely busy, and you've graciously made time to share your insights with us today. Thank you for your dedicated service to people who have a substance use disorder and preventing the disease of addiction. And thank you to our participants today. You've brought good questions, good points of discussion. Many of you have boots on the ground and experience and a lot of passion for your work and advocacy. You are all leaders and have influence, as Dr. Weiner said. And I bless you all with a happy new year, and may 2025 bring you health, happiness, and meaning. And we'll see you again in 2025 for season 5 of High Truths on Drugs and Addiction. Thank you for listening to High Truths on Drugs and Addiction, where you learn from experts from around the globe and around all aspects of drugs and addiction. This week's episode would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsor. A sincere and warm thank you to Physicians for Healthy Communities. Visit physiciansforhealthycommunities.org and view their video and resource library. High Truths producer is Dave Rivas from Davey Boy Productions. I'm your host, Dr. Ronit Lev. We hope we brought your day a little bit more High Truths.